My hands trembled as I held the sealed envelope my grandmother had secretly given me just hours before she passed. The family dinner was supposed to be about mourning, but my brother Marcus turned it into his personal victory lap, mocking how I'd wasted years caring for Grandma while he built his empire. He had no idea what was coming. Tomorrow's will reading would expose 20 years of lies, theft, and betrayal that would shatter everything he thought he knew about our family legacy. Before we dive deeper into this shocking family betrayal, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If this hook already has you on the edge of your seat, wondering what explosive secrets that envelope contains, smash that like button and hit subscribe because this revenge story gets absolutely wild. Trust me, you'll want to see how karma delivers the most satisfying justice when family loyalty becomes the ultimate weapon. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. My name is Seraphina, and for the past 5 years, I'd been the primary caregiver for my beloved grandmother Eleanor Montgomery. While my older brother Marcus lived his glamorous life as a successful businessman in the city, I'd moved back to our small Connecticut hometown to help Grandma navigate her declining health. Marcus always made sure everyone knew how much more successful he was than me. At every family gathering, he'd flash his expensive watch, talk about his latest business deals, and make subtle digs about how I was playing nurse instead of building a real career. What hurt most was how he'd convinced our parents and extended family that his financial contributions to Grandma's care were more valuable than my daily presence. The truth was devastating and had been hidden in plain sight for years. 3 weeks before Grandma passed, I was helping her organize her financial documents when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Hidden in her bedroom dresser underneath decades of family photos were bank statements and legal documents that told a horrifying story of systematic theft and manipulation. Marcus hadn't been contributing to Grandma's care at all. In fact, he'd been stealing from her for over 15 years. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Bank statements showed monthly transfers of thousands of dollars from Grandma's accounts to Marcus's business ventures. He'd convinced her to sign power of attorney documents, claiming it would help her manage her finances more efficiently. Instead, he'd used that access to fund his lifestyle and business investments while she struggled to afford her medications. But the fraud went deeper than simple theft. Marcus had been systematically manipulating Grandma's medical care to save money. He'd convinced her to switch to cheaper medications that were less effective, delayed necessary medical procedures by claiming they were unnecessary expenses, and even pressured her to downsize her insurance coverage. All while presenting himself to the family as the generous son who was financially supporting her golden years. The most heartbreaking discovery was a series of letters Grandma had written, but never sent, documenting her growing suspicions about Marcus's financial management. She'd been afraid to confront him directly because he'd convinced her that his business success was tied to her investments and that questioning him would jeopardize the family's future financial security. In these letters, she wrote about feeling confused and manipulated about how Marcus would become angry and dismissive whenever she asked questions about her finances. She described feeling trapped between her love for her grandson and her growing awareness that something was terribly wrong. The financial records showed that Marcus had taken nearly $400,000 over the years. Money that should have been used for Grandma's comfort and care had instead funded his luxury apartment, expensive cars, and failed business ventures that he'd never told the family about. But Marcus's contempt and manipulation extended far beyond financial theft. Family members later told me how he'd been actively undermining my reputation for years, suggesting to relatives that I was taking advantage of Grandma's generosity, that I was living off her instead of working, and that my caregiving was really just a way to position myself for a larger inheritance. He'd been particularly cruel in how he dismissed my sacrifices. While I was helping Grandma with daily medications, driving her to countless medical appointments, and providing emotional support during her loneliest moments, Marcus would visit for an hour every few months and then spend the entire time complaining about how exhausting it was to manage her finances. The belittlement was constant and calculated. At family dinners, he'd make jokes about how I was becoming a professional caregiver instead of finding a real job. He'd question whether I was properly managing Grandma's daily needs, suggesting that maybe she needed professional help instead of relying on family. The implication was always that I was inadequate and that his financial contributions were more valuable than my presence. What made his behavior even more disgusting was how he'd convinced our parents that his approach was more practical and responsible. He'd positioned himself as the logical, business-minded grandson who was making smart financial decisions for the family's future, while painting me as overly emotional and impractical for prioritizing Grandma's daily comfort over long-term financial planning. The documents I found revealed that every criticism, every dismissal, every moment of contempt had been a calculated effort to cover up his theft while making me seem like the problem. He'd been gaslighting the entire family for years, creating a narrative where his absence was actually more valuable than my presence. The most devastating part was realizing how Grandma had protected both of us, even as she began to understand what was happening. She'd never confronted Marcus directly because she didn't want to destroy our family relationships. Instead, she'd quietly documented everything and waited for the right moment to ensure justice would be served. The envelope she'd given me contained copies of everything, along with a letter explaining her decision to change her will in the final weeks of her life. She'd known exactly what Marcus had been doing, but she'd also known that exposing him too early would give him time to cover his tracks or manipulate the situation. As I sat in her bedroom that night, surrounded by evidence of years of betrayal and theft, I felt a combination of rage and heartbreak that I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about money, it was about the systematic destruction of trust, the manipulation of a vulnerable elderly woman, and the cruel dismissal of genuine love and care in favor of greed and selfishness. Tomorrow's will reading was going to change everything, and Marcus had no idea what was coming. The morning of the will reading arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that should have felt refreshing, but instead felt heavy with anticipation. I'd barely slept clutching Grandma's envelope and rehearsing how I would handle the moment when Marcus's carefully constructed lies finally crumbled. The law office of Patterson and Associates had been handling our family's legal affairs for 3 generations. Mr. Patterson, now in his 70s, had known our family since before Marcus and I were born. As we gathered in the mahogany-paneled conference room, I could see him watching Marcus with an expression that seemed more knowing than neutral. Marcus arrived 15 minutes late as usual, making a grand entrance in his expensive suit, and immediately launching into apologies about urgent business calls that had delayed him. He kissed our mother's cheek, shook our father's hand, and completely ignored me while positioning himself in the chair closest to Mr. Patterson's desk. "Well, since we're all here," Marcus announced with his characteristic presumption, "I think we can all agree that this process should be fairly straightforward. Grandma and I had discussed her estate planning extensively over the years." Our parents nodded approvingly, still believing in the narrative Marcus had spent years crafting about his financial responsibility and business acumen. I watched him settle back in his chair, with the confidence of someone who believed he'd successfully orchestrated the perfect long-term con. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and opened Eleanor's file. Before we proceed with the will reading, Eleanor left specific instructions for me to address several important matters that have bearing on the estate distribution. Marcus leaned forward eagerly, probably expecting praise for his financial management or confirmation of his primary beneficiary status. Instead, Mr. Patterson pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk. "Eleanor came to see me 3 weeks before she passed away." Mr. Patterson continued, his voice taking on a formal, serious tone. "She brought with her extensive documentation of financial irregularities and requested a complete audit of all transactions involving her accounts over the past 15 years. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's confident expression flickered for just a moment before he recovered with a practiced smile. "I'm sure there's some simple explanation for any discrepancies," Marcus said smoothly. "Managing elderly finances can be complicated and sometimes paperwork gets confusing." Mr. Patterson opened the folder and removed a stack of bank statements, canceled checks, and legal documents. Eleanor was remarkably thorough in her record-keeping. She documented systematic unauthorized transfers totaling $397,000 from her accounts to various businesses and personal accounts belonging to Marcus Montgomery. The silence that followed was deafening. Our mother's face went white, and our father sat forward in his chair with the expression of growing horror. "That's ridiculous," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "I had power of attorney. Every transaction was authorized and was for Grandma's benefit. I was managing her investments, and the power of attorney was obtained under false pretenses." Mr. Patterson interrupted his professional composure, unwavering. "Eleanor documented several instances where you misrepresented the purpose and scope of the document. More importantly, the power of attorney explicitly prohibited using her funds for personal investments or business ventures without her written consent for each transaction." I pulled out Grandma's envelope and placed it on the table. "Grandma gave me this the day before she died," I said quietly. "She wanted to make sure the truth came out." Marcus's eyes fixed on the envelope with a look of pure panic that he couldn't quite hide. "Seraphina, whatever you think you found, you're probably misunderstanding." "I understand perfectly." I interrupted, my voice stronger now. "I understand that while I was helping Grandma with her medications every morning, you were transferring money from her accounts to fund your lifestyle. I understand that while I was driving her to doctor appointments, you were using her money to pay for your luxury apartment lease." Mr. Patterson removed another document from the folder. Eleanor also documented instances of medical neglect and financial manipulation. Marcus convinced her to reduce her insurance coverage and delay necessary medical procedures to preserve assets that he was simultaneously stealing. Our mother stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Marcus, tell me this isn't true." "Mom, they're making this sound much worse than it is," Marcus said, his usual confidence cracking. "Yes, I used some of Grandma's money for business investments, but those investments were supposed to benefit everyone. I was trying to grow her estate, not steal from it." $397,000. Our father repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, that money was supposed to ensure your grandmother had the best possible care in her final years." "And she did have good care," Marcus protested, pointing at me. "Seraphina was there every day. My job was to handle the financial side. Your job was to steal from an elderly woman while she was dying." I said, my voice shaking with controlled rage. "Your job was to manipulate her into thinking she couldn't afford proper medical care while you were buying sports cars and funding business ventures that failed because you're not half as smart as you think you are." Mr. Patterson consulted another document. "The audit reveals that most of Marcus's business investments resulted in significant losses. The money taken from Eleanor's accounts was essentially gambling losses funded by theft from a vulnerable elderly person." The formal accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marcus looked around the room, desperately searching for any ally who might still believe his version of events. Our parents stared at him with expressions of horror and disappointment that would have broken my heart if I weren't so focused on ensuring justice was served. "Eleanor was very specific about how she wanted this information presented," Mr. Patterson continued. "She wanted the family to understand the full scope of the deception before we proceeded with the will reading. She felt that everyone deserved to know the truth about Marcus's character and actions." Marcus tried one more desperate deflection. "Even if there were some irregularities, Grandma never complained. She never said anything to me about being unhappy with how I managed her finances." I opened Grandma's envelope and removed one of her unsent letters. "She was afraid to confront you directly because you'd convinced her that questioning you would hurt the family's financial future. But she documented everything, Marcus. Every lie, every manipulation, every time you made her feel guilty for asking questions about her own money." The public exposure was complete. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, and no way for Marcus to spin the facts into something more palatable. The evidence was overwhelming. The theft was documented, and the entire family now understood exactly who Marcus really was beneath his expensive suits and practiced charm. But this was only the beginning of his reckoning. The immediate aftermath of the will reading felt like watching a controlled demolition. Marcus's carefully constructed reputation crumbled in real time as the full scope of his betrayal became undeniable. Our parents sat in stunned silence, processing 15 years of lies and manipulation, while I felt a mixture of vindication and heartbreak for what Grandma had endured alone. Mr. Patterson had recommended that we pursue both civil and criminal charges against Marcus, given the clear evidence of elder abuse and financial fraud. But I knew that legal proceedings would only be the beginning of ensuring real justice. Marcus had spent years building alliances based on deception, and now it was time to methodically dismantle every relationship he'd manipulated through lies about our family dynamics. The first crucial alliance came from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Hensley, Grandma's primary physician for over 20 years, reached out to me 3 days after the funeral. She'd heard about the will-reading revelations through our tight-knit community and wanted to discuss medical records that she'd been legally prohibited from sharing while Grandma was alive. "I've been documenting my concerns about Eleanor's care for years," Dr. Hensley explained during our meeting at her office. Marcus would attend medical appointments sporadically, but when he did come, he would consistently pressure me to recommend less expensive treatment options, even when they weren't in Eleanor's best medical interest. She pulled out a thick medical file and opened it to pages marked with yellow sticky notes. He convinced Eleanor to switch from brand-name medications to generic versions that weren't as effective for her specific conditions. When I recommended physical therapy after her hip surgery, he argued that it was too expensive and suggested she could recover just as well with home exercises. The medical evidence added another dimension to Marcus's pattern of financial abuse. He hadn't just stolen money, he'd actively compromised Grandma's health and quality of life to maximize the funds available for his theft. Dr. Hensley's documentation would be crucial for the elder abuse charges, but more importantly, her professional reputation in the community would help expose Marcus's lies to people who might otherwise give him the benefit of the doubt. My second major ally emerged from within our extended family. Uncle Robert, Grandma's younger brother, had always been skeptical of Marcus's business success stories, but had never had concrete reasons to voice his suspicions. When I shared the financial evidence with him, his reaction was immediate and decisive. "I knew something was wrong," Uncle Robert said, his face red with anger. Marcus would show up at family gatherings talking about his latest deals and expensive purchases, but whenever I asked specific questions about his businesses, his answers were always vague. He was living way beyond what his actual income should have supported. Uncle Robert had connections throughout our region's business community and immediately began making discreet inquiries about Marcus's professional reputation. Within a week, he'd uncovered additional evidence of Marcus's pattern of financial manipulation in his business relationships. 3 different business partners have stories about Marcus using family money for ventures that were never properly disclosed, Uncle Robert reported during a family meeting at his house. He convinced investors that he had significant family backing for projects, then used Eleanor's money to make initial payments that created the illusion of financial stability. The business fraud revelations were particularly damaging because they showed that Marcus's theft wasn't just opportunistic greed, it was part of a systematic pattern of using family relationships to enable financial deception. Several potential business partners had invested their own money based on Marcus's claims about family wealth, only to lose everything when his ventures inevitably failed. Our parents, initially devastated by the betrayal, gradually transformed their shock into determined action. Mom became obsessed with contacting every family member and family friend to ensure they understood the truth about Marcus's character. She felt personally responsible for not recognizing the signs of his manipulation and threw herself into damage control with the intensity of someone seeking redemption. "I keep thinking about all the times he criticized Seraphina for not having a real career," Mom said during one of our planning sessions. "He made us believe that his financial contributions were more valuable than her daily care. I feel sick thinking about how we enabled his lies." Dad took a more systematic approach, focusing on documenting every instance where Marcus had misrepresented his financial situation or made false claims about supporting Grandma's care. He created detailed timelines showing the discrepancy between Marcus's claims and the actual evidence, preparing materials that could be used in legal proceedings or shared with community members who might still believe Marcus's version of events. The alliance building wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was about reclaiming the narrative that Marcus had spent years manipulating. For too long, he'd controlled how our family's story was told to the outside world, positioning himself as the successful, responsible grandson, while painting me as dependent and emotional Mrs. Catherine Walsh, Grandma's next-door neighbor for 30 years, became an unexpected but powerful ally. She'd witnessed the daily reality of Grandma's care and had always been puzzled by the disconnect between Marcus's reputation and his actual involvement in his grandmother's life. "I saw Seraphina there every single day," Mrs. Walsh told anyone who would listen. "Rain or shine, she was taking care of Eleanor with such love and patience. Marcus would show up maybe once a month, usually just long enough to upset Eleanor about something and then disappear again." Her testimony was particularly valuable because she was a respected member of our church community and had no obvious bias in family disputes. When she started sharing her observations about the contrast between my daily caregiving and Marcus's sporadic stressful visits, it helped counter any lingering sympathy for Marcus among family friends. The momentum was building, but I knew that Marcus wouldn't accept this exposure passively. He was already making phone calls, trying to rebuild his narrative and find allies who might help him minimize the damage. The next phase of this battle would determine whether justice would truly be served, or whether Marcus would find a way to escape meaningful consequences for his years of theft and manipulation. During this period, I also connected with other victims of elder financial abuse through online support groups and legal advocacy organizations. These connections helped me understand that Marcus's behavior fit a common pattern of family financial abuse that often goes undetected for years because victims are reluctant to expose family members and because perpetrators are skilled at manipulating family dynamics. The National Center on Elder Abuse provided resources and guidance that helped me understand the legal process and prepare for the challenges ahead. Speaking with other families who had experienced similar betrayals was both heartbreaking and empowering, reminding me that seeking justice wasn't just about our family, it was about preventing Marcus from victimizing others in the future. As our alliance network grew stronger, Marcus's isolation became more apparent. Friends and family members who had once admired his apparent success began distancing themselves as the truth spread through our community. His professional relationships started deteriorating as his business partners learned about the fraud charges and began questioning their own financial dealings with him. But just as victory seemed within reach, I was about to discover that one of my most trusted allies had been playing a much more complicated game than I realized. The betrayal that was coming would temporarily shatter my confidence in my ability to judge character and trust the people closest to me. The alliance-building phase had been crucial for gathering evidence and building community support, but it had also created vulnerabilities that I hadn't anticipated. In my determination to expose Marcus's lies, I had perhaps been too trusting of people who claimed to share my commitment to justice. The betrayal came from the person I trusted most, Uncle Robert. 3 weeks after our alliance had successfully gathered overwhelming evidence against Marcus Thuris, discovered that Uncle Robert had been secretly negotiating with my brother behind my back. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, shattering my faith in family loyalty, just when I thought justice was finally within reach. I found out through a chance encounter at the courthouse. I'd gone to file additional documentation for the elder abuse case when I saw Uncle Robert leaving the building with Marcus and a lawyer I didn't recognize. They were walking closely together, their body language suggesting collaboration rather than confrontation. My stomach dropped as I watched them shake hands before parting ways. Uncle Robert had been my strongest supporter, the family member who'd helped me understand that Marcus's behavior was part of a larger pattern of fraud. Seeing him in what appeared to be a friendly meeting with Marcus felt like watching my entire world turn upside down. That evening, I confronted Uncle Robert directly. His response was worse than I'd imagined. "Seraphina, you have to understand the bigger picture here," he said, his tone taking on the same patronizing quality I'd heard from Marcus for years. Yes, Marcus made some mistakes with Eleanor's finances, but destroying his life completely isn't going to bring her back. The word mistakes sent rage coursing through my veins. Mistakes? I repeated, my voice shaking. Uncle Robert, he stole nearly $400,000 from his dying grandmother. He compromised her medical care to fund his lifestyle. Those aren't mistakes, they're crimes. Uncle Robert shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Marcus has agreed to pay restitution. He's willing to return a significant portion of the money and make sure the family is compensated for any losses. But if we pursue criminal charges, everyone loses. His career will be destroyed, his ability to repay the money will be compromised, and the family will be dragged through years of public litigation. I stared at him in disbelief. You're talking about a deal. You've been negotiating a deal with Marcus without telling me. I'm trying to protect this family from further damage, Uncle Robert replied defensively. Eleanor is gone, Seraphina. Nothing we do now will change that. But we can still protect the family's reputation and ensure that Marcus learns from his mistakes without destroying his future completely. The betrayal cut deeper because Uncle Robert had been the one person who'd seemed to understand the full scope of Marcus's manipulation. He'd helped me document the business fraud, connected me with other victims, and provided emotional support during the darkest moments of discovering the truth about my brother's character. Now I realized that his support had been conditional and strategic. Uncle Robert had been gathering information not just to ensure justice, but to position himself as a power broker who could negotiate the family's response to Marcus's crimes. "What did he offer you?" I asked quietly. Uncle Robert's face flushed red. "This isn't about personal gain, Seraphina. This is about practical family management." "What did Marcus offer you?" I repeated, my voice harder now. The silence stretched between us before Uncle Robert finally answered. "Marcus has agreed to include me in his business recovery plans. If we can resolve this privately, he'll have the opportunity to rebuild his ventures and potentially recover the family's losses through future success, rather than through criminal prosecution." There it was. Uncle Robert believed he could profit from helping Marcus escape meaningful consequences for his crimes. He'd positioned himself as the reasonable family mediator while secretly planning to benefit from Marcus's future business ventures. The realization that Uncle Robert had been playing both sides felt like a second death in the family. I'd lost my grandmother to Marcus's greed and neglect, and now I was losing Uncle Robert to his own version of family financial manipulation. "You're just like him," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "You're willing to sacrifice justice for personal gain. You're willing to let Marcus escape consequences as long as you get a piece of whatever he builds with the money he stole." "That's not fair, Seraphina. I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone." "Everyone except Grandma," I replied. "Everyone except the victim who can't speak for herself anymore." The temporary defeat felt overwhelming. Uncle Robert's betrayal wasn't just about losing an ally, it was about realizing that family loyalty could be just as corrupted by greed as everything else Marcus had touched. I'd spent weeks building trust with someone who'd been secretly planning to benefit from the very crimes we were supposed to be exposing. Even worse, Uncle Robert's defection gave Marcus new ammunition in his campaign to minimize consequences. Now he could claim that even Eleanor's own brother believed in redemption over punishment, that the family was divided about how to handle the situation, and that pursuing criminal charges was really just about my personal vendetta rather than seeking justice. The isolation was crushing. Our parents, still processing their own shock and guilt, were being pulled toward Uncle Robert's practical approach. They wanted to believe that there was a solution that could restore family harmony without the mess and publicity of criminal trials. Marcus, emboldened by Uncle Robert's support, began reaching out to other family members and community leaders, presenting himself as someone who'd made mistakes but was committed to making things right. He emphasized his willingness to pay restitution and his desire to rebuild family relationships through actions rather than through the legal system. Dr. Hensley and Mrs. Walsh remained supportive, but their influence was limited compared to family members who were blood relatives. The business partners Uncle Robert had contacted were backing away from providing testimony concerned about getting involved in what now appeared to be a complicated family dispute rather than a clear-cut case of fraud. For the first time since discovering Grandma's evidence, I began to doubt whether justice was possible. Marcus had always been skilled at manipulating family dynamics, and now he was using those same skills to turn my quest for accountability into a narrative about family division and excessive punishment. The betrayal taught me that in family financial abuse cases, the victim often faces isolation, not just from the perpetrator, but from family members who prioritize harmony over justice, who fear public embarrassment more than they value accountability, and who can be manipulated into believing that forgiveness is more important than consequences. That night, sitting alone in my apartment surrounded by evidence that should have been enough to ensure justice, I felt the full weight of what it means to stand up for someone who can no longer speak for themselves. Grandma had trusted me with the truth, but I was beginning to understand that truth alone might not be enough to overcome family politics and the powerful desire to avoid difficult consequences, but I wasn't ready to give up. If Uncle Robert's betrayal had taught me anything, it was that I needed allies who were completely outside the family power dynamics, people who couldn't be bought or manipulated by promises of future gain or threats of family discord. The fight for justice was about to enter its most crucial phase. Just when everything seemed lost, salvation came from an unexpected source. Eleanor's longtime financial advisor, Patricia Kemp, who had been conducting her own investigation into Marcus's activities. Patricia contacted me a week after Uncle Robert's betrayal, requesting a private meeting at her office. I'd never met her personally, but Grandma had mentioned her occasionally as someone who'd helped manage certain investments over the years. Eleanor came to see me 6 months before she died. Patricia began, her professional demeanor barely concealing obvious anger. She was concerned about discrepancies in her account statements and wanted an independent review of all her financial transactions. Patricia opened a file that was even thicker than the one Mr. Patterson had presented at the will reading. What I discovered was far worse than simple theft. Marcus had been systematically manipulating Eleanor's investment portfolio, selling stable income-producing assets to fund his business ventures, then replacing them with high-risk investments that he claimed would generate better returns. The evidence Patricia presented was devastating and completely indisputable. She had documented every unauthorized transaction, every forged signature, and every instance where Marcus had misrepresented his activities to both Eleanor and to financial institutions. The investment fraud alone represents an additional $200,000 in losses, Patricia continued. Marcus wasn't just taking money from Eleanor's checking accounts. He was gambling with her retirement savings and investment portfolio. When his ventures failed, instead of admitting the losses, he would forge her signature to authorize additional risky investments, trying to recoup the money he'd already lost. But Patricia's evidence went beyond financial documentation. As a licensed financial advisor, she'd been legally required to report suspected elder abuse to state authorities. Her reports, filed over the past 18 months, created an official paper trail that couldn't be dismissed as family infighting or personal vendettas. I've been working with the state's Elder Abuse Investigation Unit, Patricia explained. They've been building a criminal case against Marcus independent of any family complaints. My role was to document the financial evidence while they investigated the broader pattern of abuse. This revelation changed everything. Uncle Robert's private negotiations with Marcus were irrelevant because the state had been building a criminal case that didn't require family cooperation to proceed. The evidence Patricia and the state investigators had gathered was so comprehensive that Marcus couldn't plea bargain his way out of serious consequences. There's something else, Patricia said, removing another document from her file. Eleanor asked me to prepare a detailed analysis of what her financial situation would have been if Marcus hadn't been stealing from her. The numbers are heartbreaking. The analysis showed that Eleanor could have afforded significantly better medical care, could have remained in her own home with professional nursing assistants, and could have left substantial inheritances to her grandchildren if Marcus hadn't been systematically looting her accounts. She could have lived her final years with dignity and comfort, instead of worrying about whether she could afford her medications, Patricia said quietly. Marcus didn't just steal money, he stole her peace of mind and quality of life during the most vulnerable period of her life. Patricia also revealed that she'd been secretly working with other financial advisors in the region to identify additional victims of Marcus's schemes. Through professional networks, she discovered 3 other elderly clients who had similar stories about Marcus convincing them to invest in his business ventures and then losing their money through incompetence or fraud. Marcus has been using his family connections and his grandmother's reputation to gain access to other vulnerable elderly people in the community, Patricia explained. Eleanor's case isn't isolated, it's part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior targeting seniors. The existence of additional victims transformed the case from a family dispute into a criminal enterprise. Marcus wasn't just a grandson who'd made poor decisions with family money, he was a predator who'd systematically targeted elderly people for financial exploitation. Patricia introduced me to Detective Sarah Martinez from the state's Elder Abuse Investigation Unit, who had been building the criminal case against Marcus for over a year. Detective Martinez's evidence was overwhelming and professionally documented in a way that no family member could dispute or negotiate away. Marcus Montgomery is facing charges for elder abuse investment fraud forgery and operating an unlicensed investment scheme, Detective Martinez explained during our meeting. The evidence Patricia gathered combined with testimony from multiple victims creates a case that prosecutors consider extremely strong. Detective Martinez also revealed that Marcus had been under surveillance for months and that investigators had recorded several conversations where he discussed his manipulation tactics and expressed contempt for his elderly victims. In one recorded conversation, Marcus laughed about how easy it was to convince elderly people to trust him because they assumed family connections meant honest intentions, Detective Martinez said. He specifically mentioned Eleanor and described her as too trusting and not smart enough to understand complex financial decisions. Hearing that Marcus had mocked Grandma's intelligence and trust while simultaneously stealing from her was more painful than any of the financial evidence. It confirmed that his cruelty went beyond simple greed to include genuine contempt for the woman who had loved and trusted him unconditionally. The criminal investigation also revealed evidence that contradicted Uncle Robert's claims about Marcus's willingness to make restitution. Financial records showed that Marcus had been hiding assets and transferring money to offshore accounts in preparation for the possibility that his theft would eventually be discovered. He's been planning an exit strategy for over 2 years, Detective Martinez explained. The restitution offers he's making to family members represent a fraction of what he actually stole, and he's only willing to return money he can't hide or protect through legal maneuvers. Patricia and Detective Martinez had created an alliance that was completely immune to family politics and financial manipulation. Their evidence was professionally gathered, legally admissible, and comprehensive enough to ensure that Marcus would face meaningful consequences, regardless of Uncle Robert's negotiations or family pressure to avoid public trials. For the first time since Uncle Robert's betrayal, I felt hope that real justice was possible. More importantly, I understood that Grandma's decision to document everything hadn't just been about protecting our family's inheritance, it had been about protecting other vulnerable elderly people from becoming Marcus's future victims. Eleanor knew that stopping Marcus was bigger than just family justice, Patricia said as our meeting concluded. She wanted to make sure he could never do this to anyone else's grandmother. The professional alliance between Patricia and Detective Martinez represented exactly what I'd needed, but hadn't known how to find people who understood that elder abuse is a serious crime, not a family problem to be resolved through private negotiations and forgiveness. Marcus's reckoning was finally coming, and this time there would be no family politics or emotional manipulation to help him escape the consequences of his actions. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but Marcus's fate was sealed on the second day, when prosecutors played the recorded conversation where he laughed about manipulating stupid old people who trusted him because of family connections. The jury's reaction was immediate and visceral. Several members visibly recoiled when they heard him describe Grandma as too senile to understand real money management. Marcus received 7 years in federal prison for elder abuse fraud and operating an unlicensed investment scheme. The judge specifically noted that the sentence reflected the calculated cruelty and systematic nature of the defendant's crimes against multiple vulnerable victims. He was also ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, including nearly $600,000 to our family's estate. But the legal consequences were only the beginning of Marcus's complete downfall. Within hours of the guilty verdict, local news outlets picked up the story. Local businessman sentenced for elder abuse scheme became the top story on every regional news platform. Marcus's professional reputation was destroyed overnight as business partners, clients, and potential investors learned about his criminal convictions and systematic fraud. His luxury apartment was seized as part of the restitution order. His expensive cars were sold at auction. His business licenses were revoked, and his professional certifications were permanently suspended. The life he'd built with stolen money simply evaporated. Uncle Robert faced his own reckoning when Detective Martinez revealed that his secret negotiations with Marcus had potentially obstructed justice. While he wasn't criminally charged, the family's trust in him was permanently shattered. He'd lost his moral authority, and his relationship with me and other family members began questioning his judgment and motivations in family financial matters. Our parents went through their own transformation during the trial. Hearing the recorded evidence of Marcus's contempt and cruelty forced them to confront how completely they'd been manipulated by his lies. Mom started therapy to process her guilt about not recognizing the abuse, while Dad became an advocate for elder abuse awareness in our community. We enabled him by believing his lies about Seraphina, Dad said during his victim impact statement. We thought financial contributions were more valuable than daily care and love. We were wrong, and Eleanor paid the price for our blindness. The most profound change was in my own understanding of family and loyalty. Marcus's betrayal and Uncle Robert's opportunism had taught me that blood relationships don't guarantee integrity or genuine care. Real family is built on shared values, mutual respect, and consistent actions, not just genetic connections. Patricia Kemp became more than just a professional ally. She became a mentor and eventually a close friend. Through her, I connected with other people who'd fought similar battles against family financial abuse. This community of survivors became my chosen family people who understood the unique trauma of being betrayed by someone you're supposed to trust unconditionally. Dr. Hensley and Mrs. Walsh remained important parts of my support network, representing the kind of authentic loyalty that transcends family obligations. They'd stood by the truth even when it was uncomfortable and socially complicated. I also discovered my own strength and purpose through this experience. The investigative skills, emotional resilience, and advocacy abilities I'd developed while fighting for justice became the foundation for a new career in elder rights advocacy. Patricia helped me get certified as a financial abuse investigator, and I now work with families facing similar situations. 3 years later, I can see how Grandma's final gift wasn't just the evidence that exposed Marcus's crimes. It was the opportunity to discover who I really was when faced with the ultimate test of character and determination. She'd known that fighting for justice would transform me into someone stronger and more purposeful. The money Marcus stole has been almost entirely recovered through asset seizures and ongoing restitution payments. But more importantly, his conviction led to legislative changes in our state that strengthened protections for elderly people and created better oversight mechanisms for family managed financial arrangements. I visit Grandma's grave every month and tell her about the other families I've helped protect from financial abuse. I tell her about the legislation that bears her name and the Elder Advocacy Center that was established with part of the recovered funds. I tell her that her suffering wasn't meaningless, that it led to protection for countless other vulnerable elderly people. Sometimes people ask if I ever feel sorry for Marcus rotting in federal prison with no visitors and no prospect of rebuilding his former life. The honest answer is no. His crimes weren't mistakes or lapses in judgment. They were the systematic exploitation of trust, love, and vulnerability for personal gain. He showed no remorse during the trial, no genuine understanding of the harm he'd caused, and no concern for anyone except himself. The chosen family I've built through this experience is stronger and more authentic than the biological family Marcus's lies had fractured. We're connected by shared values rather than shared genetics, by proven loyalty rather than assumed obligation. On difficult days, I remember Grandma's final words to me. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones we most need protection from. But there are always good people willing to stand up for what's right even when it's hard. She was describing both the problem and the solution. Marcus represented the betrayal that can hide within family relationships. But Patricia Detective Martinez, Dr. Hensley, and Mrs. Walsh represented the authentic care and justice that still exists in the world. Justice wasn't just about punishing Marcus. It was about creating a chosen family based on integrity, protecting other vulnerable people from similar abuse, and transforming trauma into purpose. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Maybe you've watched someone you loved being taken advantage of by people who were supposed to protect them. The hardest lesson I learned is that sometimes real love means standing up against the people who share your DNA when they're hurting someone vulnerable. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with family karma and justice in the comments below. Smash that like button if you believe accountability matters more than keeping family secrets. Hit subscribe for more stories about standing up for what's right, and share this with anyone who needs to know they're not alone in fighting family betrayal. Thank you for joining me on this journey from betrayal to justice. Remember, chosen family built on shared values will always be stronger than blood family built on lies. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone we love is ensuring their truth is heard even after they're gone.